For 11 long, uncertain months, Anne Marten told her husband the same unsettling thing, over and over, until he finally stopped arguing with her about it. She had dreamed, 3 separate nights running, that her stepdaughter Maria was buried inside the red barn, beneath the right-hand grain bin, in the exact spot she could describe down to the floorboard. Thomas Marten was not a man inclined toward dreams as evidence of anything. He dug anyway on the 19th of April, 1828, if only to put the matter to rest. He did not have to dig deep. Beneath the grain, wrapped in a coarse sack, was his daughter, badly decomposed after 11 months in the ground, but unmistakably her, identified within hours by her own sister from a scrap of clothing, a strand of hair, and a single missing tooth. Tonight we revisit a case that began with a wedding dress hidden inside a bundle of men's clothing, and ended with a dream that a mother could not stop having until the ground finally gave up what it was hiding. One farmer's son with a talent for convincing lies, one young mother who believed she was finally about to be made respectable, and one barn that kept her secret for 11 months before it stopped keeping it at all. This is Soil of Crime, and I am glad you are here for this one. Before we go any further, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. The case of Maria Marten begins in Polstead, Suffolk in 1801, in a rural county where a family's respectability could be built or destroyed by considerably less than what would eventually happen to her. She was born on the 24th of July that year, the daughter of Thomas Marten, a mole catcher, a trade that placed the family solidly among Polstead's working poor rather than its landowners or its tenant farmers. By the time she reached her 20s, Maria had already lived a life considerably more complicated than village respectability usually allowed a young woman to admit to. She had borne 2 children by 2 different men before she ever became involved with William Corder, one of them fathered by Corder's own older brother Thomas, a child who did not survive infancy, and a second, a boy named Thomas Henry, whose father, Peter Matthews, sent money regularly for the child's support without ever marrying her. In a small agricultural parish, where a woman's reputation was tracked as closely as any farmer's harvest, Maria Marten carried, by her mid-20s, exactly the kind of history that left her vulnerable to any man offering the one thing she did not yet have, a path to being made an honest woman at last. William Corder was, by the account of nearly everyone who knew him before 1827, precisely the wrong man to offer that path, and precisely the kind of man practiced enough to make the offer sound sincere anyway. Born around 1803, the son of a prosperous local farmer, he had earned the schoolboy nickname Foxy for a slyness that followed him into adulthood without ever quite softening. His record before he ever met Maria included fraudulently selling pigs that belonged to his own father, passing a forged cheque for £93, and joining a local thief known as Beauty Smith in an actual pig theft, an escapade infamous enough that Smith himself is reported to have said, of the young man beside him, that he would be damned if Corder did not hang for something one day. Sent away to London in disgrace after these episodes, Corder returned to Polstead only when tragedy forced him to. His brother Thomas drowned crossing a frozen pond, and within 18 months his father and 2 more brothers were dead as well, leaving William, the family's least trusted son, as the one who remained to run the farm alongside his mother. Picture for a moment what that succession of losses actually did to the Corder household. A mother who had buried a husband and 3 sons in under 2 years was left with exactly one surviving child to lean on. the one son the family had spent years regarding as its least reliable member, the boy the other children at school had nicknamed for his cunning rather than his character. Whatever suspicion Polstead harboured about William Corder's past dealings, his mother's practical situation left her with little real choice but to trust him with the farm, the family name, and whatever reputation the Corders had left to protect. It is difficult to know whether that sudden, unearned position of trust emboldened him further, but it certainly did nothing to slow him down. There is a harder truth sitting underneath Maria Marten's early life that this record has no interest in softening. A small agricultural parish like Polstead judged women who bore children outside marriage with a severity it never extended to the men who fathered those children. Peter Matthews, who never married Maria, despite fathering her surviving son, faced no comparable damage to his own standing in the parish, simply continuing to send maintenance money and otherwise living his life largely unscrutinized. Maria, by contrast, carried the social weight of both children publicly and permanently, her reputation the one actually placed on trial by her neighbours long before any court did the same to her killer. That asymmetry is not incidental to what happened to her. It is close to the centre of it, because it meant that a man offering her marriage, however dishonestly, was offering something the entire structure of village life had made unusually difficult for her to secure any other way. What happened next, on a spring afternoon in 1827, would keep a whole village talking for 2 centuries. Stay with me. This is Soil of Crime, and if you have not yet subscribed, now is the moment to do it. Corder and Maria began their relationship in March of 1826, and by 1827, when Maria was 25, she was pregnant again, this time by Corder himself. That child, too, did not survive, and later rumour in the village suggested its death may not have been entirely natural, though no charge was ever brought and no confirmed. Verifiable grave for the infant has ever actually been located. Whatever the truth of that earlier loss, Corder appeared, at least outwardly, to intend marriage. What he actually proposed, in the spring of 1827, was considerably stranger than an ordinary wedding. He told Maria that the parish authorities intended to prosecute her over her illegitimate children, an entirely invented threat, and that the two of them needed to meet secretly at the Red Barn, a landmark building on his family's land, before travelling on together to Ipswich to marry quietly and avoid the scandal. He instructed her to disguise herself in men's clothing for the journey to the barn, to avoid drawing attention, telling her, in effect, to become unrecognizable on the very day she believed she was finally becoming his wife. On the 18th of May, 1827, a Friday, Maria Marten walked to the Red Barn dressed as a man, carrying, by every account she left behind, genuine hope that her long, complicated search for respectability was about to end. She did not leave the barn alive. The exact mechanism of her death remains, even now, genuinely disputed. Evidence pointed toward a gunshot wound. A handkerchief, Corder's own, was found knotted around her neck, raising the possibility of strangulation, either alongside the shooting or instead of it. A puncture wound near her eye socket suggested, to some examiners, a stabbing, though later analysis raised the real possibility that this particular injury was caused not by Corder at all, but by her own father's spade, 11 months later, during the desperate, hurried digging that finally recovered her body. What is not disputed is that William Corder walked out of the Red Barn that day, and Maria Marten did not. Or sit with the specific cruelty of that disguise for a moment. He did not simply lie to her about a wedding that was never going to happen. He asked her to change her own silhouette, to walk to her own death dressed as someone she was not, on the one day she believed she was finally becoming exactly who she wanted to be. The borrowed men's clothes, the invented warrant, the false urgency, all of it existed for one purpose only, to make Maria Marten harder to place and harder to trace once she stopped being seen at all. He turned the last ordinary choice she ever made into an unwitting piece of his own concealment, months before anyone else even knew there was anything left to conceal. What followed Maria's death was 11 months of letters, each one a small, deliberate act of cruelty layered on top of the murder itself. Corder wrote to Maria's family claiming she was safe, first in Ipswich, then further away, still eventually settled with him on the Isle of Wight as his lawful wife. When her family asked why she never wrote herself, he supplied excuses. She was unwell. She had injured her hand. Her letters had simply been lost in transit. For nearly a year, Maria Marten's own family lived with the entirely reasonable belief that she was alive, married, and simply preoccupied, unaware that the man supplying every reassuring detail was writing from a village a short distance from the barn, where her body lay buried beneath his own family's grain. Think for a moment about what it actually required to sustain that fiction for 11 consecutive months. Every letter Corder sent had to account for the last one, matching invented dates against invented illnesses, against an invented address on an island Maria had never once visited. A single careless inconsistency, one letter contradicting another on a detail as small as which week her hand had supposedly been injured, could have unraveled the entire story at any point. It did not unravel through his own carelessness. It held for the better part of a year, sustained entirely by a family's reasonable, trusting assumption that a daughter who had gone quiet simply had her own reasons, an assumption Corder understood well enough to exploit for exactly as long as he needed to. Corder himself did not remain in Polstead to maintain this fiction in person. He drifted, eventually settling in London and remarkably remarrying. He placed advertisements of all things, seeking a wife in the Times, the Morning Herald, and the Sunday Times, drawing well over 100 replies across the 3 papers combined, though he collected almost none of them once he had already found what he was looking for, a woman named Mary Moore, who became his wife with no idea whatsoever of what had happened to the woman who came before her. Together they opened a boarding school for young ladies at Everley Grove House in Brentford, West London, and by the spring of 1828, William Corder wanted for nothing as far as any official record yet showed, was running a respectable establishment for other people's daughters, less than a year after burying one of his own victims beneath a Suffolk grain bin. Consider the sheer audacity required to build that particular new life. A man capable of burying a pregnant woman beneath his family's own barn floor did not flee into hiding or obscurity. He advertised for a wife in 3 national newspapers, married, and opened a school responsible for the safety and reputation of other families' daughters, trading, without apparent hesitation, on exactly the kind of trust he had already proven himself willing to destroy completely. That fiction held for 11 months, right up until Anne Marten's dreams finally overrode her husband's skepticism and sent him digging into his own grain bin on the 19th of April, 1828. Word of the discovery reached London quickly, and constable heirs, working alongside James Lear of the Bow Street Runners, traced Corder to Everley Grove House through his old Polstead address. Lear gained entry to the school under the pretext of wanting to enroll his own daughter there. and found William Corder exactly where a man with nothing to hide would be found. At breakfast, in the parlour, with his new wife nearby. A search of the property turned up pistols, a set of letters that appeared to warn of some coming danger, and a French passport, evidence that suggested a man who understood on some level that his new life might not last. Pause hold two images together for a second. A dead woman buried under grain for nearly a year, and, less than a day's travel away, the man who put her there sitting calmly at a breakfast table, running a school for other families' daughters. Both of those things were true at the same time. What the courtroom did with that contrast is coming next. This is Soil of Crime, and if a story like this is worth telling honestly, subscribe so the next one finds you. Corder was tried at the Shire Hall in Bury St. Edmunds, the proceedings opening on the 7th of August 1828, before the Chief Baron of the Exchequer, William Alexander. Public interest was so intense that hotels in the town filled from the 21st of July onward, and admission to the courtroom itself was strictly by ticket, a level of spectacle that turned Maria Marten's murder trial into one of the defining public entertainments of the entire decade. To guard against any technical failure of the case, prosecutors indicted Corder on 9 separate charges, including forgery, ensuring that even if the central murder charge somehow faltered, he would not simply walk free. The most damning testimony came not from any adult witness, but from a child, 10-year-old George Marten, Maria's own young half-brother, who told the court he had seen Corder carrying a loaded pistol before the murder, and later walking away from the barn with a pickaxe in hand. Corder's own defense claimed he had argued with Maria and left the barn, only to hear a pistol shot behind him and return to find her already dead, his own weapon lying beside her, an account the jury needed just 35 minutes to reject entirely. He was hanged at Bury St. Edmunds on the 11th of August, 1828, before a crowd historians have estimated at anywhere from 7,000 to 20,000 people, offering in his final moments a confession as brief and as final as the verdict itself. "I am guilty, my sentence is just, I deserve my fate, and may God have mercy on my soul." A crowd that size, gathered specifically to watch one particular man die, is worth sitting with rather than passing over as a footnote to the sentence itself. Somewhere between 7,000 and 20,000 people organized their entire day, some traveling considerable distances on foot and by cart, around witnessing William Corder's execution in person, packed shoulder to shoulder for a view of a single scaffold. They came the way people now queue overnight for a concert or a film premiere, treating a man's death as the defining public event of their summer. What happened to his body afterward says as much about the era's appetite for this case as anything that happened in the courtroom. More than 5,000 people queued to view his corpse before Cambridge University students and physicians conducted a formal dissection the following day, at one point attaching a galvanic battery to his limbs to demonstrate for an audience of onlookers the muscle contractions the current produced in dead tissue. Phrenologists examined his skull and announced, with the confident pseudoscience of their era, that they had found unusually developed regions corresponding to secretiveness, acquisitiveness, and destructiveness, and correspondingly little development in the regions they associated with benevolence, treating the shape of a dead man's skull as though it could retroactively explain everything he had done. It is worth remembering that phrenology carried genuine scientific authority in 1828, taught and debated by serious men in serious institutions, and that the examiners who ran their fingers across Corder's skull believed, sincerely, that they were advancing medical understanding rather than performing an elaborate and entirely groundless ritual. The confidence with which an entire era can be wrong, dressed in the full authority of contemporary science, is itself a lesson this case preserves just as clearly as anything about Corder or Maria individually. A surgeon named George Creed later tanned a portion of Corder's own skin and used it to bind a printed account of the murder, a volume that survives today in Moyses Hall Museum in Bury, St Edmunds. His skeleton was displayed for public viewing, first at West Suffolk Hospital and later at the Hunterian Museum in London, standing for decades beside the bones of the notorious thief-taker Jonathan Wild, until it was finally cremated in 2004, nearly 176 years after his execution. Consider, for a moment, what an entire county did with its horror and its fascination once the trial itself was over. A pair of glasses Corder wore at trial and a snuff box bearing Maria's own likeness were later sold by his widow. Lengths of the rope used to hang him sold for £1 apiece. A portion of his scalp, with an ear still attached, was reportedly displayed for a time in an Oxford Street shop window. This was not private grief being processed quietly. It was public spectacle, monetized at every stage, treating a murdered woman's death and her killer's execution alike as raw material for an eager commercial market that never seemed to run short of buyers. The trial itself deserves a closer look than the tourist economy that followed it, because the courtroom in Bury St Edmunds was, in its own way, as much a public performance as anything the melodrama stages would later stage. Tickets changed hands for entry to a murder trial the way they might for a popular play, and the presiding judge's own evident discomfort with the volume of press coverage did nothing to slow the crowds gathering outside. 10-year-old George Marten, called to testify against the man who had courted his own half-sister, delivered the single most damaging piece of evidence in the entire proceeding, a child's plain, unembellished account of a loaded pistol and a pickaxe carrying more weight with the jury than any amount of adult speculation about motive ever could. There is something particularly stark about a case where a young boy's simple, factual memory outperforms every adult witness the Crown called a reminder that the clearest testimony in a courtroom is not always the most sophisticated one. Before we close the record on this one, it is worth naming just how thoroughly this case reshaped the small world it came from. Polstead itself became a tourist destination almost overnight, drawing an estimated 200,000 visitors in 1828 alone, so many that the Red Barn itself was gradually stripped down by souvenir hunters, its timbers pried loose and sold, quite literally, as toothpicks, until the structure burned down entirely in 1842. Maria Marten's own gravestone fared little better, chipped away over the following decades by visitors wanting a physical fragment of the story to carry home, until nothing legible remained of it at all. Today, only a modest shed sign marks the approximate site of the vanished barn, and a quiet residential street called Martin's Lane preserves, in name only, the woman whose murder built and then consumed an entire local tourist economy in the space of a single remarkable summer. There is something particularly uncomfortable about how quickly Maria Marten herself became a character rather than a person in the years that followed. Flattened into a stock figure of Victorian melodrama, the fallen woman punished for her own past rather than remembered as the specific, complicated 25-year-old mother she actually was. The theatre versions of her story rarely dwelt on her mole-catcher father, her two earlier children, or the very real social calculus that made Corder's dishonest promise of marriage worth the risk it turned out to be. They dwelt instead on spectacle, on the gunshot, on the barn, on the dream, because spectacle sold tickets in a way that an honest accounting of rural poverty and gendered double standards never quite could. The story did not stay confined to Suffolk for long. A melodrama titled Maria Marten, or The Murder in the Red Barn, became, by most accounts, one of the most performed plays of the entire Victorian era, staged in theatres across Britain for decades after the actual participants were dead. Broadsides carrying Corder's confession and execution details sold, in total, well over 1 million copies, and at least 5 ballads commemorating the murder appeared in print within days of his hanging. A folk song built around the case, still catalogued today as Roud 215, was still being sung and recorded by rural performers as late as 1908, 80 years after the crime it described. 5 separate film adaptations followed across the 20th century, including a 1935 version built around the actor Tod Slaughter's theatrically villainous portrayal of Corder, a performance style that leaned fully into melodrama rather than anything resembling the more complicated, more human man the trial record actually describes. Consider what more than 150 years of theatre, ballads, broadsides, and film adaptations actually did to this story. Each retelling simplified the case a little further, sanding down Maria Marten into a warning about fallen women and William Corder into a stock villain, twirling his moral corruption for a paying audience, until the actual, specific, unresolved facts of the case, the disputed cause of death, the missing burial record for their first child, the affair rumours swirling around Anne Marten herself, were gradually replaced by a tidier story more comfortable to perform on a stage than to sit with honestly. A later investigator, writing more than a century after the trial, went further still, suggesting that a local woman entirely outside the Corder and Marten families might have been responsible, a theory built on speculation rather than fresh evidence and never accepted by serious historians of the case. That such a theory could gain any traction at all, a century and more after a jury spent just 35 minutes convicting William Corder on evidence that included a child's eyewitness account and his own inconsistent confession, says something about how uncomfortable this case has always made people, and how badly some have wanted a tidier villain, or none at all. Rather than sit with the genuinely unresolved edges of the true one, there is one question this case has never fully answered. Anne Marten was, by several accounts, barely a year older than her own stepdaughter, and persistent rumour suggested she and Corder may once have been involved, raising the possibility that jealousy over his marriage to Mary Moore, rather than any genuine dream, was what finally sent her husband digging into that grain bin. Corder's own confession, admitted to an argument with Maria about the risk of the burial site being discovered, a detail that sits uneasily beside his testimony that he merely heard a shot and found her already dead. Those two accounts cannot both be true, and 198 years later, no one has ever settled which part was the lie. That is the case of William Corder and the murder in the Red Barn. This is Soil of Crime. If this story stayed with you, subscribe and share it with someone who loves history as much as you do, and tell me in the comments which part of it you believe least. Every comment keeps these forgotten stories alive, and we read every one. I will see you in the next case. What survives of Maria Marten today is smaller than what survives of the man who killed her, and there is a quiet, ongoing injustice in that imbalance. Her killer's skull was measured and theorized over by phrenologists. His skin bound a book about her murder. His skeleton stood on public display for nearly 2 centuries. She has a lane named after her and a shed sign marking roughly where a barn once stood. Her actual grave, worn away by decades of visitors chipping off souvenirs until nothing legible remained. It is, in its own understated way, the same imbalance that shaped her entire short life. A world considerably more interested in preserving the details of the man who destroyed her than in preserving any physical trace of her at all. Right down to the ground she was finally, briefly, let to rest in before even that was worn away.